before Elvis swiveled his hips, before the Beatles played a single note. One man lit the fuse that blew music wide open. He screamed. He pounded the piano like it owed him money, and he wore more sparkle than a chandelier at midnight. In the 1950s, his voice was so wild radio stations didn't know whether to ban it or play it on repeat. His shows were so explosive they broke down segregation barriers without a single speech. He didn't just sing rock and roll, he built it, brick by brick, beat by beat, and the world would never be the same. This is the untamed, unapologetic story of the one and only, Little Richard. Chapter 1. Macon, Georgia. Richard Wayne Penniman's story begins on December 5th, 1932, in Macon, Georgia, a small southern city that, at the time, was split right down the middle by segregation. On one side, you had gospel choirs filling the air with hallelujahs. On the other, smoky juke joints pumping out the blues. And young Richard grew up with one foot in each world. He was the third of 12 children in the Penniman household, a house so full that privacy wasn't even a concept. His father, Charles Bud Penniman, was a brick mason by day, but he also ran a local nightclub. His mother, Leva May, was the spiritual backbone of the family, keeping them rooted in church life. This mix of Saturday night sin and Sunday morning salvation would shape Richard's entire outlook on life. Richard wasn't born into privilege. His family lived in a poor neighborhood, and from an early age, he faced challenges. He was born with one leg slightly shorter than the other, which gave him an unusual walk. In school, kids teased him for it. They also teased him for his high-pitched voice, his skinny frame, and the fact that he was more flamboyant than most boys his age. But those early wounds became the fuel that pushed him to stand out, not shrink back. At home, there was always music. His mother sang hymns, and the radio played gospel greats like Mahalia Jackson. But it was the electrifying voice and guitar of Sister Rosetta Tharpe that really caught his attention. Here was a woman in a sparkly dress, playing guitar like a man and singing with the power of a preacher. Richard thought, if she can do that, maybe I can too. By his early teens, Richard was singing in the church choir, his voice already stretching to those trademark screams that would one day echo around the world. But while the church crowd clapped and shouted, "Amen," there was a restlessness in him. The church was powerful, yes, but so was the sound spilling out of the nightclubs across town. He could hear the pounding drums, the wailing saxophones, and the cheers of people having the time of their lives. That mix, the sacred and the sinful, became the heartbeat of Little Richard's music. Chapter 2. The Road to Tutti Frutti. Richard's teenage years were not the typical stay-out-of-trouble kind. He ran away from home more than once, chasing the music wherever he could find it. By the age of 15, he was touring with traveling shows and vaudeville-style acts. These weren't glamorous gigs. Sometimes he sang in tiny clubs, sometimes under circus tents, and sometimes right on the street corner. One of his early breaks came when he was invited to open for Sister Rosetta Tharpe herself. She had come to town for a concert, and Richard was asked to sing before her set. The crowd loved him. Sister Rosetta loved him too, enough to pay him for the performance. That single moment was a spark of validation. But Richard didn't just want to be good, he wanted to be unforgettable. On stage, he started experimenting with his look. He wore flashy clothes, styled his hair into a tall pompadour, and began painting his face with makeup. Some people laughed, some people stared, but everyone remembered him. Breaking into the recording industry, however, was another battle. In the early 1950s, Richard recorded a few songs, but they didn't take off. Record labels thought he was too much, too loud, too fast, too wild. They didn't know how to market someone who didn't fit the clean-cut crooner image of the time. That all changed in 1955. While working in New Orleans, Richard walked into Cosimo Matassa's J&M studio, the same place where rhythm and blues hits were being made by the likes of Fats Domino. During a break in recording, Richard sat at the piano and launched into a raunchy little tune he had been playing in clubs, shouting that now famous phrase, "The room stopped." Producer Bumps Blackwell knew instantly they had something special. They cleaned up the lyrics for radio but kept the pounding rhythm and Richard's raw, untamed energy. When Tutti Frutti hit the airwaves, it wasn't just a song, it was an explosion. The speed, the screaming falsetto, the wild piano runs. It was unlike anything teenagers had heard before. Within weeks, jukeboxes across America were spinning it non-stop, and Richard Wayne Penniman became Little Richard, a name that would never be forgotten. Chapter 3. The Architect of Rock. By 1956, Little Richard was no longer just a musician. He was a phenomenon. His shows were pure chaos, in the best possible way. He didn't just play the piano, he attacked it. Fingers flying across the keys, foot stomping in time, hair bouncing with every movement. His voice could leap from a low growl to a high-pitched wail in a heartbeat. The hits came one after another. Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, Good Golly, Miss Molly. Each one faster, louder, and more infectious than the last. And each one made teenagers go wild and parents nervous. But here's the thing. Little Richard wasn't trying to play it safe. His pompadour was higher than most people's ambitions. His suit sparkled under the stage lights. He wore eyeliner and bright lipstick. In the 1950s, this wasn't just unusual, it was shocking. People didn't know whether to be outraged, fascinated, or both, and that was exactly the point. Richard was breaking every unwritten rule of the time. He was a black man drawing massive crowds of both black and white teenagers in the middle of a segregated America. His concerts were some of the first where barriers between audiences started to blur, and that terrified the establishment. In some towns, police tried to enforce segregation at his shows. But as soon as Richard started playing, the crowd couldn't help themselves. People jumped the barriers and danced together. His stage presence was electric. He'd jump up from the piano, toss his leg on top of it, and scream into the mic. He'd throw in jokes between songs, keeping the crowd laughing and screaming at the same time. In an era when most performers stood still behind a microphone, Little Richard turned the stage into a playground. He wasn't just making music. He was rewriting what a rock and roll performance could be. That's why they called him the Architect of Rock. He wasn't building on someone else's blueprint. He was creating it from scratch. Chapter 4. Influence that shook the world. Little Richard's influence spread fast, and it reached the very people who would go on to dominate music for decades. In Hamburg, Germany, a young scrappy band called the Beatles opened for him during one of his tours. Paul McCartney has said that he learned how to sing rock and roll by copying Little Richard's style. You can hear it in Beatles songs like I'm Down and Long Tall Sally, which they actually covered directly from Richard. Across the Atlantic, the Rolling Stones were watching too. Mick Jagger studied how Richard moved, how he worked the crowd, how he made every person in the room feel like part of the show. Jagger later admitted that Richard's energy was a blueprint for the Stones' own performances. And then there was Jimi Hendrix. Before Hendrix became a guitar god, he played in Little Richard's band. Imagine that. The man who would redefine the electric guitar once stood in the background, night after night, watching Richard tear up the stage. Even Elvis Presley, who was already a superstar, openly praised Little Richard. Elvis called him one of the greatest and often performed his songs. Richard's style was so ahead of its time that it went beyond music. His flamboyant look and unapologetic personality laid the groundwork for artists like Prince, David Bowie, and later, even Lady Gaga. Anyone who's ever mixed outrageous fashion with rock music owes a nod to Little Richard. But his influence wasn't just about the big names. He showed everyday kids that you could be yourself, loud, bold, and different. And not only would people accept you, they might love you for it. For teenagers in the 1950s, that was a radical idea. By the late 50s, his music was everywhere. Radio DJs couldn't get enough of it, and record sales skyrocketed. Little Richard had gone from a bullied kid in Macon to one of the most talked-about entertainers in the world. And he'd done it entirely on his own terms. Chapter 5. Walking Away. In 1957, at the very height of his fame, Little Richard did something nobody saw coming. He walked away from rock and roll. It happened during a tour of Australia. Richard had been performing to massive crowds every night, but during one flight, he claimed he saw a vision in the sky. A bright light shaped like a giant fireball. He took it as a sign from God. A few days later, while still in Australia, he announced to the press that he was leaving the music business to dedicate his life to ministry. It was a shocking move. Imagine a star today, with #1 hits on the charts and sold-out concerts, suddenly giving it all up overnight. But that's exactly what Richard did. He enrolled in a Bible college and began preaching. For several years, he recorded only gospel music. His hair was still big, his voice still powerful, but the message had changed. The man who once sang "Good Golly, Miss Molly" was now singing about salvation. Still, rock and roll wasn't done with him. And deep down, Richard wasn't done with rock and roll. By the early 1960s, he was tempted back to the stage, performing again in England, where the rock boom was in full swing. There, he discovered that a new generation of musicians, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and many more, had been carrying his torch while he was away. Chapter 6. The King of Comebacks. Little Richard didn't just have a comeback, and he had several. Each time he returned, he seemed to reinvent himself. In the early 1960s, he came back to a music scene that had changed dramatically, but he still knew how to steal the spotlight. Tours across the UK and America reintroduced him to audiences who had only heard his records, and they were not ready for the sheer force of his live performances. In the 1970s, Richard leaned into his larger-than-life personality. He became a fixture on television talk shows, game shows, and variety programs. He played himself in movies, his quick wit and over-the-top charisma making him a natural on camera. Even if you weren't a rock and roll fan, you knew Little Richard. One of his biggest pop culture moments came in the 1980s, when he appeared in everything from children's shows to commercials. He wasn't just a musician anymore, he was an icon. The hair was bigger, the suits were flashier, and the woo was louder than ever. No matter the decade, Little Richard had a way of making people smile. His energy was infectious, his confidence unshakable, and his impact undeniable. Every time he returned, he reminded the world who had helped start it all. Chapter 7. Legacy of Fire. Little Richard wasn't just a musician, he was a cultural earthquake. Over the decades, he received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and honored by the Library of Congress for his impact on American music. But beyond the trophies and titles, his true legacy was how he changed what was possible for performers. He proved that you could be unapologetically yourself, loud, bold, and completely different. And not only survive, but thrive. He inspired generations of artists to push boundaries, from Prince and Elton John to David Bowie and Lady Gaga. Anyone who's ever strutted onto a stage in a glittering outfit and dared to be different owes something to Little Richard. Even late in life, he never stopped speaking his truth. He would tell interviewers, "I am the innovator. I am the emancipator. I am the architect of rock and roll." And the thing is, he was right. Without him, rock might not have had the fire, the flash, or the freedom it became known for. Little Richard passed away in 2020 at the age of 87, but the music, the energy, and that unstoppable a wop bop, a loop bop, a lop bam boom will never fade. Every time a piano pounds and a crowd jumps to its feet, that's his spirit, still shaking the world. If you enjoyed this journey through the life of Little Richard, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves the roots of rock and roll. Tell me in the comments, what's your favorite Little Richard song? And if you want more deep dives into the legends who shaped music history, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on.